Good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Samir Paranche. I head the forensics practice at Grant Thornton. Today, we are going to have a very interesting, hopefully interesting webinar on prevention of sexual harassment, redesigning our policy for a new normal. One admission: I'm a consultant. Consulting is what I do, but please be assured that I will not be using a lot of jargon to the presentation. So new normal is something I couldn't avoid. So that's tick one for me. The way we are going to do it is fairly simple. We'll start with an introduction, just giving you a perspective on the incidence of or rising incidence of sexual harassment in India. We'll follow up by giving a sort of a backdrop in terms of what are the relevant Indian laws on prevention of sexual harassment and how have they evolved. Then some industry best practices to prevent sexual harassment, and then key considerations to relook at your policy. Now, please note that in all these aspects, we will be sort of giving you a flavor of what it is. For example, how are Indian laws, how to look at it in the new normal, in a work from home, virtually working scenario. Similarly, when we talk about key considerations to really look at your policy, we'll also look at it from the perspective of working from home. So without much ado, let me start. So sexual harassment in the workplace a rising concern, but that is not a correct statement. Sexual harassment of women has been going on for a long, long time, and it is fairly commonplace. It is just that with a stronger legal framework, at least since 2013, a lot more awareness campaigns that are being run by companies, by the government, by public bodies. If there is a just lot more awareness, plus there is slightly some semblance of a supportive ecosystem that is evolving, as a result of which certain women, which is again a significant minority of women, have gathered the courage to report such incidents. So this again needs to be viewed in the perspective of sexual harassment was always there. It is just that because of the changing time, certain women gathered the courage to go and report sexual harassment. It is a fact of life that there are significant such cases which still continue to be unreported. Now, what is sexual harassment? Essentially, what the law does is has identified into four buckets. Essentially, it is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. Now, what is unwelcome? Essentially, it's any of those four categories classified there. Something that makes you uncomfortable, something that offends you, something that humiliates you, insults you, or something that intimidates you. The key determinant factor that needs to be considered is intention of the harasser do not count. It is not something one thought about. It was not something that was designed that way. Oh, I never looked at it that way, is something that is not given credit. What matters are only two things and two things only, which is what the action was and what was the result in terms of how did they made that individual feel, which is, as I said, uncomfortable, offended, humiliated, and intimidated. Now, according to the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Act, any of the following constitutes sexual harassment. Most of us on the call are HR or professionals who have sort of deal with these issues, so we are aware of it. I will not spend too much time on it, but just 2, 3 points I'd like to make. Point number right at the middle of the table, there is something called as implied or explicit promise of either preferential treatment or detrimental treatment. So something that says that if you do XYZ, you will get a leg up, or something if you don't do XYZ, you'll be sort of actions will be taken which will be to your detriment. The other thing is also an implicit or explicit threat about the victim's present or future employment treatment. Very important. So the idea is that the law has kept the definition to be very wide to cater to a variety of cases, and it provides for direct as well as implied sexual conduct. Now, what the key operative word is implied. Implied is in the eyes of the beholder, so to speak. So what is implied sexual behavior for one person may not be the same for other person. Hence, implied will depend only and only on the interpretation of the person, or as is referred to as the potential victim in those. So that is a very critical part. Certain illustrations, just to sort of be just given the sensitive nature of the law. Now, there are certain cases which do not classify as sexual harassment. So, ended up being scolded for your superior on account of performance measures, attitude measures is not sexual harassment. Someone asking you out but withdraws after you show or refuse disinterest, that is not sexual harassment. A co-worker flirting with you, now this is slightly in the gray territory, but if it is friendly and within limits as perceived by the person, then it is not sexual harassment. Now, what is definitely sexual harassment is you miss a work deadline, but you end up being abused by your superior. Someone asks you out persistently, even after you have turned the person down and amply shown disinterest. And a coworker flirts with you even after about multiple times, making you uncomfortable. So clearly, there is a thin line which sort of differentiates with behavior, but that line is broad enough for law to take its own course. Now, let's look at it from a COVID-19 perspective, right? Since 24th March 2020, all of us have been in a, for want of a better word, semi-state of lockdown, right? 4 months in a lockdown, then we go to office again, then COVID comes back again, then we start working from home again. So obviously, the definition or the construct of what an office is, what a workplace is, what our official hours has clearly undergone a sea change. So, for example, in keeping line with the new normal, and this please note this is only the second time that I've relied on jargon. Keeping in line with the new normal, these are certain instances which can be construed as sexual harassment. So as we have written in the right in the top of the slide, sexual harassment in the workplace has not ended. It has just gone digital. It has just changed its clothes. It's appearing in some other form. So what are some of those examples in this work from anywhere, work from home environment? Colleague taking screenshots during a meeting without consent, sharing it to others, finding it and then sharing it on the next WhatsApp group, turning up inappropriately dressed for a virtual meeting, insisting on full view of the person's body and not just face during video calls, use of unprofessional emojis, undefined working hours, insisting on late night meetings virtually with video on. So clearly, these are sort of some of the things that companies, stakeholders need to pay attention to because, as I said, our lives have changed potentially forever. What is workplace has changed. What our work hours has changed. What is an office has changed. So clearly, some food for thought for us. Now let's sort of, as I said, just look at the evolution of Indian laws on the on prevention of sexual harassment at workplace. Right at the beginning, there was the seminal Vishakha judgment in 1997, based on the infamous Babri Devi case, which sort of led together to a coalition of NGOs coming together and filing in a case in the Supreme Court, resulting in the seminal Vishakha judgment, which actually said the first time defined it as that sexual harassment is a human rights violation. It is a violation of the constitutionally guaranteed fundamental rights. And obviously, the Supreme Court sort of laid down a guideline that there has to be a guideline to fill the legislative vacuum. There is a vacuum as far as sexual harassment was concerned, at least at that point of time, and that guideline, that vacuum needs to be filled. That resulted in what is now the current governing act, which is the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Act 2013. The act came into force from 9 December 2013. It superseded the Vishakha judgment by the Honorable Supreme Court, and the judgment outlined a series of guidelines which the act has essentially incorporated. What it did for potentially the first time, clearly clarifying, is did it define the employer as well as, more importantly, in a country like India where MSMEs and our organized sector potentially employ 70-80% of the workforce. They employ what a workplace is. So employer, it was defined as any person responsible for the management, supervision and control of the workplace. It also laid down certain guidelines whereby it said that management includes person or board or committee responsible for formulation of such policy. It also said that employer is duty bound. The act says the employer is duty bound to initiate disciplinary action against the officer involved or against the individual involved in sexual harassment. More importantly, what it did is it defined what a workplace was. So it defined and fairly gave a broad definition in order to cover the unorganized sector, in order to cover sections like domestic workers, etc. So clearly it widened the ambit of what exactly employment or employer used to be looked at. Additionally, what it did is it also said that if harassment were to take place even during transportation, in places like Mumbai, where I'm based, at least pre-COVID, people used to take 1.5 hours, 2 hours just to go from their homes to their offices. If harassment takes place even during transportation or during a lunch meeting at a restaurant, which is a formal lunch meeting, the same will be covered during the act. So clearly, it laid out a fairly strong construct to tackle sexual harassment. Now, given what, as I said, and I touched upon it earlier, the new normal work from home, is it an extended workplace? I don't think there is a clear answer. But if you just sort of look into what the POSH Act, Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act says, now workplace also includes, as per the act, a dwelling place or a house, thus potentially making it clear that act applies to everybody who's working from their own home, leased home, company leased home, or any other form of accommodation, any place thus that can come under the ambit of a work related relationship. So clearly, there are experts that believe that under the POSH Act, it has given enough flexibility to cover work from home as well. Now, if work from home were to be covered, home is still a physical construct. What about the virtual place that we operate in, that we work in, where I am having a chat with all of you? SMS, chat, Zoom meeting, Microsoft Teams meeting, Google Meet. Is it workplace? We are carrying out work-related activities, and similarly does conduct in video calls, personal comments on social media platforms. Social media is just exploded, right? Anybody is on LinkedIn, and what they say on social media is potentially more important than anything else. Any inappropriate messages on social media, undefined working hours, does it constitute sexual harassment? So more questions, and more questions for us to ponder. Here, what we are going to cover is what does the Act lay down in terms of the resolution mechanism. So the Act clearly said that there has to be an internal complaints committee. All workplaces employing 10 or more persons are required to constitute an internal complaints committee. That which provides that even if offices, administrative units are located at different places at subdivisional or divisional level, it has to be constituted at all administrative units or offices. So for a large company, saying ICC is based in wherever the headquarters is may not work. You'll have to sort of constitute it all administrative offices. So if you are following a zonal network, you'll need to have a West Zone, East Zone, South Zone, North Zone sort of ICC. Secondly, the Act provides that there should be minimum of 4 members on the ICC. Half of the members will have to be women. And among the 4 members, the presiding officer of the ICC will have to be appointed, and it will have to be a woman at a senior level in that office. So clearly, amongst the 4, the president or presiding officer has to be a senior employee of that organization. 2 members of the 4 have to be somebody who are committed to the cause of women, experience in social work, legal knowledge. So potentially lawyers, people from the NGO sector, development sector, social sector. And 1 member from an NGO or women's organization, or who is familiar with issues relating to sexual harassment. Now, these are for established small to medium to large size companies. What happens for entities which are smaller than that? So let's say, example, a workplace has less than 10 employees. It need not form an IC. Obviously, if you have 7 people working, you cannot have a ICC. But what you can do is you can go to the local complaints committee, which has been set up by the Act by the district officers of each district in the country. Also, in a case where a complaint has to be filed against the employer himself, the local complaints committee has to be approved. So clearly, the Act has laid down saying in the event that any person needs to make a complaint, what is the mechanism that is available. It has also laid down in fair amount of detail what is the grievance redressal process, and I'll just sort of walk you through. The grievance redressal process, I think the first and foremost time or point that is important is that is the time of 90 days. Typically, the Act says that any incident of sexual harassment has to be reported and a complaint made to the LCC, ICC, as the case might be, within 3 months from the date of incident. Now, there are a host of factors where that might not be possible, including the person concerned who faced the harassment, the victim, if I may say so, was not well, was hospitalized, was indisposed, probably is no more. In that case, and certain such other cases, the Act provides that there is the facility to complain even after 90 days, but the reasons for the delay have to be recorded in writing. So even if it is, let's say, it's been 6 months since the incident happened and somebody has to make a complaint for it, you can still make the complaint, but along with the complaint, you have to give a reason in writing as to why the delay was. Why did the initial timeline of 90 days as defined in the Act was not met? Now, once a complaint is made, there are sort of 2 aspects to it. The complainant can say that she doesn't want conciliation, she doesn't want a settlement. In that case, an inquiry is constituted, uh, which will be looked upon, which will be monitored by the ICC. The inquiry report will be submitted to the employer and parties. In that, there are sort of two aspects to it. Either the allegations will be proved or the allegations are not proved. If the allegations are not proved, no action is to be taken. More importantly, it is to be ascertained whether the charges were false or malicious. As happens with any law in India, with most well-meaning legislations in India, there is 0.0001% of the population where false charges are put in place to settle personal score. So in that case, assessment have to be made whether the charges are false and malicious, and then subsequent action needs to be taken in case the charges are found to be false and malicious. In case allegations are proved within 60 days, punishment has to be taken as per the service rule, and monetary pay penalty is payable to the agreed limit. Now, in case coming back where the allegations were not proved, the ICC again, even if let's say a complaint made, investigation done, it was found that the allegations do not hold true, the ICC then needs to inquire whether the allegations were made with a malicious intention. Inability to substantiate the complaint, very important to note, or provide adequate proof does not amount to malice. Malice means nothing of that sort happened, which can be evidenced, and clearly it was done to settle scores. The other bucket that I'm talking about is where a complainant has sort of made a complaint. There is clear cut evidence of it not being malicious, but the complainant is not able to provide adequate proof, then that doesn't constitute malice. So, very important point. Now, this is in case where the complainant doesn't request for conciliation. In case the complainant says that she is ready for a conciliation or a settlement, then the settlement, it has to be clarified that the settlement is not monetary. The ICC to record the settlement and forward to LCC and the other parties are concerned, and that's the end of the thing. So this is in a nutshell the process that has been laid down by the Act. Now, this is something that, being in the forensics profession, this is something that we come across. I will neither confirm nor deny how much of it pertains to cases that we have solved. So, what happens is, as I said, we have been under lockdown for on and off during the last 15 odd months. Obviously, companies have continued to operate. Most of them have quite seamlessly started operating, at least the large corporations in the virtual world. As I had said, sexual harassment, that doesn't mean sexual harassment has stopped, it has only gone digital. So let's take a situation where the ICC of a company has received a complaint during COVID lockdown. Now, given it is lockdown, people can't go to office, everybody is locked in. Due to this, in-person meetings as sort of mandated in the law cannot be held, and IC considers conducting a virtual inquiry in order to meet the timeline of 90 days. However, the complainant is unable to join the meeting because some of her family members are at home. This is a deeply embarrassing situation for a lot of people, and hence the complainant doesn't want to take the phone call, attend the hearing in presence of a family member. Consequently, as a result, IC is forced to defer the inquiry. Now, the above thing, account of the lockdown, is considered as a force majeure event. Force majeure, again, is defined as an event that can neither be anticipated nor controlled, like natural disasters, war, act of terrorism, medical epidemics, etc. The COVID-19 pandemic was identified as a force majeure event by the GOI in a notification in February 2020. So what it does, it also impacts the inquiry process under POSH law. Now, in case, since COVID-19 lockdown was a completely an event beyond the control of anybody, the IC has to then make relevant efforts. So number one, in-person hearing is not possible. End of story. So then the IC is under the obligation to inform both the parties, the complainant and the person against whom the complaint is made, regarding the lockdown, and make attempts to mitigate the delay by identifying an alternate mode of inquiry. In case, even if that is not possible, let's say in spite of the best efforts of the IC, the inquiry was not possible. In that case, the IC will be relieved from conducting the inquiry until the event. By event in this case is the lockdown. ceases to exist, provided their attempts have at finding alternate modes have failed. Further, once let's say in this event the lockdown opens, the inquiry will have to be initiated immediately after the event ceases to exist, which is lockdown ceases to exist, and then completed within 90 days. The reason for the delay in inquiry must be recorded in the inquiry report by the IC. So simply put, what it says is, let's say in a working from home environment, there is a sexual harassment complaint which is made to the IC. The IC, and if in the event of a lockdown, the IC should A, make efforts to conduct it virtually. In case if virtually is not possible, they should look at alternate means if possible to conduct that. Even if that is not possible, then they should wait for the lockdown to end or favorable conditions to sort of resume. Once that is done, they should immediately start the inquiry and finish it within 90 days. The only thing to note is all of this should be well documented. The fact that IC made an effort to conduct an inquiry online, multiple serious attempts were made by the IC to conduct the inquiry online. For the following reasons, the inquiry could not be conducted online due to multiple attempts. And then the decision was taken to sort of wait for the lockdown to end and then the inquiry began. So the law or for the force majeure sort of potentially does provide the flexibility to take care of once in a blue moon instances like lockdown. Now, what are some of the industry best practices to prevent and manage sexual harassment? So clearly three buckets, awareness, support, and prevent and protect. Prevention of sexual harassment, again, cliche number three after the new normal, prevention is better than cure. Uh, there are two or three things that sort of need to be done, right? First and foremost, employees need to be in awareness, need to be made aware that there is something called as a, uh, 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 something called as a sexual harassment policy that is in place. This is how it is exercised. These are the situations in which people can seek redress, and this is the procedure for that complaint to be made. Maybe a virtual, maybe phone call and email ID, etc. More importantly, there have to be workshops to make people aware about their inbuilt unconscious bias. Many a times, what is absolutely harmless fun, and at least that is the defense put forward by a lot of men, is that, oh no, I never meant it that way. Oh, I don't think this is harmful at all. I think it is just simple banter. So please, all of us suffer from unconscious biasness of all shapes and sizes. The first and foremost in awareness is to make your staff aware that such biases exist. Second, as I said, make them aware of the framework in place to deal with sexual harassment. So clearly, awareness and training go hand in hand. The second is support. Ensure that you are always supportive of your team, especially in times like COVID, where people are working from far off, they don't meet in offices, they don't have coffees together, so there is no teamwork, etc. So please, managers especially, please check in with your team subtly, saying, have there been uncomfortable situations that your women staff may have faced, and sort of just sort of check in to see if everything is online. Provide helpline support via phone or email to employees by third-party counselors. Many a times, what we have seen is even in companies with best intentions, where helpline and email IDs are set up, if it is seen that helpline and email IDs are manned by people in the company, the uptick or the use of it is very limited, because people are very cagey, saying, you know what, if I complain, the person answering at the end of the phone is somebody in the CXO's office. What guarantee I have that I will not be retaliated against? So if it is sort of banned by a third party counselor, it shows that it is independent and clearly inspires more confidence in people to follow that. And most importantly, and this is something that I always tell all my clients, senior management to set a strong tone at the top. Advocate a zero tolerance policy, and by zero tolerance I mean zero tolerance. Zero tolerance should not be just restricted to sort of flyers and posters in the HR team's room, or having some ethics week, or whereby you sort of train people. In case you sort of come across any particular complaint, please investigate impartially, and if the person is found guilty, ensure that strict action is taken. Not only strict action is taken, most importantly, ensure that that action is cascaded and communicated to people down the line. This will really then add weight to your argument that this genuinely is a zero tolerance company and in which such practices are not followed. Many a time, and this not only happens in instances involving sexual harassment complaints, but even in instances involving fraud, the other stuff that I do, which is fight fraud, whereby in instances where companies have found employees to be involved in misconduct, they take the easy way out, ask them to resign, and all well with the world. And so don't do that. It is given how the justice system in India is still evolving, it may get slightly complexing if you were to sort of take strict action against that individual. But in the long run, it is the only right way to do it. So this was on support. Last but not the least, prevent and protect. We are in the age of technology. Technology is everywhere. Google knows when I visit my parents, when I don't visit my parents. So though I'm not talking about pitfalls of technology, since technology is everywhere, use it as an enabler for workplace safety. Tracking public transport to GPS, especially in companies that have a large workforce which provide pick up and drop services to employees. Please ensure that use technology to enhance workplace safety. Conduct background checks, very, very important. Conduct background checks of people who are going to be in people management roles. Please try and identify what were the reasons that that particular individuals left their last jobs, which seem to be a super cushy and a lucrative job. You don't know what sort of skeletons are hidden in somebody's cupboard. So please carry out background checks on individuals, at least individuals who are in people management or people leadership roles. And conduct, most importantly, conduct awareness sessions not just for employees but for your entire third party ecosystem, suppliers, vendors, even customers in certain cases, so that they can enable and you sort of enable them to report any unwelcome behavior with sexual undertone. Now, key considerations to look at your posh policy in light of COVID-19. As I said, first and foremost thing that needs to be looked at is, does the policy recognize work from home? The policy should clearly articulate a workplace, which today is my home. I am having a chat with all of you sitting in my home, where official business is conducted from. As I said, the POSH Act does provide flexibility for that. So please ensure that you have a relook at your policies and it reflects that. Who all are covered? So as I said, the POSH Act is not just restricted to employees of the organization, but also extends to your third-party ecosystem, clients, vendors, trainees, visitors, etc. As companies engage more and more staff on a contractual basis, we are in the middle or at the start of the gig economy, as they say. Clearly, workplace models, employment contracts are going to change. Please ensure that the people who are in scope under the POSH Act is not restricted. Please have a look at it to ensure that it is sort of a fairly wide definition and it clearly articulates that who all are the stakeholders are the people that are actually fall under your company's POSH policy. Otherwise, what will happen is if you sort of leave it undefined, it will open the door for future disputes or litigation in the days to come. Addressing ethical dilemmas. Uh, the ICC is in any organization is not just to investigate or redress cases, but also to prevent them. So clearly, your POSH policy, I mean, let it not be a one pager which just lays down what is there in the act. As I said, please look at it to see how you can sort of make it current, fit for purpose, and in line with the current environment. So the POSH policy should address questions on what can be construed as virtual harassment. And we talked about some of the things, right? Conduct on video calls, personal comments, etc. Along with clarifying what is the company's standpoint. So clearly, that's an area that one should look at. Uh, uh, the other part is, how do you provide a redressal mechanism? Earlier, you had provided a post box or an email ID or a telephone ID. I'm working from home. Uh, let's say, I'm a lower level employee. I essentially a part of the workplace management team. I still need to go to office once a week. There is nobody in the office. How do I complain? So the POSH policy should clearly articulate how the aggrieved can file a complaint via email or a phone. One practical problem that people face is, if you keep email, phone, we as a country are fairly. I mean, we are not comfortable sort of dialing up, giving our name and sort of filing a complaint. We still, on account of the fear of retaliation, we sort of tend to give anonymous complaints. Secondly, given the sensitive nature of this, people may or may not be comfortable complaining on phone. So if then email is the only way that is there. Imagine, as I said, same example, somebody who sort of manages your office, keeps it clean, is a part of the cleanliness staff. How can she write? I mean, you expect her to write an email to be able to make a complaint. So please, these are some of the, whenever we have helped sort of companies in designing their POSH policies, these are some of the factors that I advise my clients on. How, so please ensure that you sort of take these aspects into consideration and provide an appropriate redressal mechanism to provide complaints. Similarly, with digital harassment, many women may not report due to lack of confidence, fear of losing jobs, etc. So, in the digital workplace, how do you sort of build confidence in your entire redressal mechanism exercise? The other way that we have found, and we have sort of seen it at two of our clients, is make it proactive. Obviously, the POSH Act is relies on an that a particular incident has happened, a complaint is made, and then sort of it it is then reported to the company. Make it proactive. Use things like surveys, regular check-ins, virtual town hall. In fact, surveys we have found are extremely potent in identifying such latent sort of incidents. In one client that we helped on, the client sort of did a survey. There were, I think they had set up the policy, they had sort of set up a helpline, they had set up an email where people could sort of write in. And I think in over a 2-year period, they had one or two complaints. When they did the survey, and obviously they kept the responses anonymous, they took and they took great pains to convey to the employee base that this is a survey. Whatever response you give will be treated absolutely anonymously. Your name will not be tracked saying person XYZ has given this responses, and it will be collated by a third agency. And the results were startling, to be honest. Out of post that survey, they realized about 12% of their female workforce had actually said experienced sexual harassment of some nature at the workplace in the last 18 months. While if you see, though they had carried out the POSH Act and there was an email ID and there was a telephone ID, there were two complaints in 2 years. So clearly, as I said, let's sort of have a very proactive sort of engagement with the team on this. The other is a tough one saying, should one consider going beyond the law? And the answer, at least in my mind, my personal opinion is the answer is one, which is yes. Although the POSH Act is applicable to women, there are increasing instances of men being sexually harassed as well. So please ensure that, as I said, ensure that the POSH regulation, POSH policy is not restrictive. It does not restrict people who are being harassed from complaining. With workplace diversity and inclusion sort of gaining long overdue importance, companies can look at the policy to sort of include both men, women, and potentially transgenders as well if they are a part of the company. Last but not the least, continuous monitoring of the implementation of the policy. I think there is enough research floating around which says that the changes in everything in the way of our life, especially professional life, technology, employment, nature of employment, that we will experience in the next 5 to 8 years will be more than anything that we have experienced in the last 30 years. So clearly, we are in the middle of a massive vortex of change. And the only thing we can do to sort of ensure is that let be there a refresh exercise, which is instituted, formally instituted in your company, which ensures that your policy is continuously updated. It is updated, it is fit for purpose, it is refreshed, and it essentially captures the current environment. It is not something that, it is not an old relic which was made post the Act in 2013 and then set in stone. Nobody then decided to do anything about it. So what typically we do, and we do this for clients, is they have instituted an annual review carried out by firms like ours to review the performance, to review the policy, review the performance of the ICC, review the constitution of the ICC. If the same people are on the ICC for the last 8 years, do you think it probably needs a refresh, new ideas, new generation needs to be brought in? So we sort of help companies redesign their frameworks around these areas as well. And so as I said, there are 6 elements in which you have to sort of relook at relook at your POSH policy to ensure that it is current with existing regulations. We have sort of the summary of which I have already talked about in the session today. We have come up with a thought leadership document which talks about this, which is available on our website. So in case if you are interested or if your firm is interested, please visit our website www.grantthomson.in and download the report. And I'll be happy to take questions now. Kashmira, over to you.
Thanks, Samir. We have some very interesting questions that have come in, and in the interest of time, we'll take probably the top 10 or 15 questions. But we would encourage everybody, in case of any further questions, please feel free to write to us at the email IDs that is being displayed on your screen. So the first question that we have is from Krishna Patil. His question is, does ICC have a power of a civil court? If yes, what does it mean? Please elaborate.
Sure. So Kashmir, you want to take that? And
sure.
Then
Sure. So yes, definitely the ICC has been accorded the powers of a civil court. And by that, we mean that the ICC has the powers for calling witnesses and documents, along with, of course, other powers and responsibilities. What it also means is that the powers of a civil court extend to the point that the ICC can ask for presence of individuals, which is not just the complainant and the respondent, but also witnesses to the incident, as well as documents, and they have the full authority to take measures and actions if requests by the ICC are not followed. So I hope that answers your question with regard to ICC having powers of a civil court.
And just a clarification, the reason I essentially asked Kashmira to give that answer is Kashmira has played a role on the ICCs of previous organizations she has worked with, as well as she's currently on the ICC of our firm. So that's hardcore practical experience you have with. Yeah, next question.
Okay. The next question is there any law available which also protects men at the workplace against sexual harassment?
No, I think if you see the Sexual Harassment Act specifically deals only with women, and the act is called Prevention of Sexual Harassment of Women 2013. And clearly that's why if you see our recommendation for a policy was to make it more inclusive and include men as well. I'm aware that certain NGOs are sort of making a representation to the Ministry of Child and Women Development, seeking a more broader definition of the POSH Act.
Okay, sure. We have another question from Sanjay Jagtap. His question is quite interesting. In a hypothetical situation where you observe sexual harassment of a colleague, female or male, but the victim is not raising their voice for reasons known to them, who can raise the issue? Will this issue raised be covered under the POSH or the whistleblower policy?
And Kashmir, you want to have a go at that? It relates to the current case that you're looking at. Anyway.
Sure. Yes, so the short answer to that question, Sanjay, is yes. Apart from the person, the victim, whether it's a female or a male, anybody else can also raise a complaint to the ICC. And by this, we mean in case of the complainant's physical incapacity to actually raise a complaint, the complainant's relative, friend, co-worker, or any person who has knowledge of the incident can send a complaint to the ICC with the written consent of the complainant. Also, in case of the complainant's death, any person who has knowledge of the incident can also send in the complaint to the ICC. In case of mental incapacity also, the Act allows for the complainant's relatives, friends, any guardian, or any other person who has knowledge of the incident to actually send in the details of the complaint to the ICC. We have also another question from Sindhuja who says, can the complainant take back the case once filed?
Yes, I think the complainant can take back the case once filed, but if it has reached the ICC, if you remember, there were two loops. One was the settlement or conciliation loop, and the other was the where the person making the complaint is not ready for a conciliation or settlement. But if the complainant has to take the case back, there is a specific explanation that needs to be given by the person making the complaint in writing as to why she's taking back the complaint. One of the key things that the ICC looks at, and we have sort of helped ICCs on the matter, is if the complainant is taking back the complaint under any duress or coercion. I think then the mandate of the job of the ICC in that case is to rule out that the complainant is taking back the complaint due to duress, under duress, or due to coercion. And once it is satisfied that that is the case, then they can proceed.
Sure. We have another interesting question from Sangeeta. Can a female member of the company who is also a member of the ICC panel make a complaint to the ICC?
Yes, she can definitely make a complaint to the ICC. Obviously, in that case, she will have to recuse herself from the hearing, given that she's the complainant. The ICC will need to be sort of reconstituted, uh, keeping in mind what the Act has laid down. But she definitely can make it.
We also have a question from Jyoti. As per the Act, ICC needs to reappoint the member. Can the same member continue in case of reappointment?
Krishna, you want to take that?
Yeah. So usually the Act suggests, Jyoti, that members of the ICC need to be rotated on every 3 years. So of course, once the term of 3 years is over, you cannot be reappointing the same member, but subsequently that can be done. The next question is from Mona Lisa. Who can be designated as an employer in case of an organization having multiple workplaces?
The employer would be the person that you are. Okay, let me take this question in two formats. So one, if you're meaning multiple workplaces, meaning multiple offices, your employer remains the same. In case if you are, let's say, a part of a staffing organization, whereby you are part of staffing organization ABC, but you have been seconded to work at organization XYZ. In that case, since your workplace in that place is because you're working in company XYZ, since you have been seconded there, obviously the harassment, if any, if it takes place in XYZ, then you make the complaint in XYZ, provided the company's POSH policy covers third parties. And if you recollect, in the 6 tenants aspects that I spoke about, which need refresh, that's why I said POSH policy should not be restrictive in nature and not just cover employees. We need to cover contractual employees as well. Kashmir, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, Samir. The next one is, which authority do we have to submit the annual returns? Is it the Labor Department or concerned district collector? So,
take that?
Yeah. So as per Section 22 of the Act, it does state that the employer needs to report all the number of cases that have been filed under this Act in the annual report of the organization. Where such annual report is not prepared, the number of complaints and how many have been redressed, how many are pending more than 90 days, details of these will have to be submitted to the district officer. Can the accused be allowed to cross-examine the complainant? How do you deal with cross allegations made by accused on past enmity of complainant and whether her statement needs corroboration?
So there are two things, and Krishna, you can come in with your ICC experience. Typically, in such cases, is where the firm will, the ICC will hire an independent agency which will carry out an impartial investigation, trying to verify if the counterclaims made by the accused hold any water. Parallelly, it will also see if there is evidence to suggest whether the complaint made by the complainant, there is evidence backing that up. What we do is we essentially work under the direction of the ICC and report to them. We carry out our investigation, submit a report to the ICC, which then sort of takes it on board and conducts and takes the inquiry forward. And Kashmir, you can probably cover the ICC.
Yeah, sure. So the answer to that, I mean, just to add on to what Samir also mentioned, of course, the accused cannot be, the respondent cannot be actually cross-examining the complainant. The whole purpose of having the ICC is to avoid such situations where the respondent or the complainant come in and they have a dialogue one-on-one. So the way these cross allegations are managed is through the ICC, where they would actually conduct an inquiry and look into each aspect of the allegations made by both the parties. Whether the statements need corroboration, of course, for each allegation there would be a particular investigation, which not only includes documents but also speaking to witnesses who are aware of the incident, and based on that, the ICC would arrive at a particular conclusion.
So I'll just like to add there. So when Kashmira talked about an investigation will look at all aspects. Number one, obviously data available. So by data, I mean any emails sent, any WhatsApp chat sent, any SMSs sent, which can be used as evidence by either party. The other is witness statements, whereby if a certain inappropriate behavior happened in the presence of certain people, we will, as an independent agency, when we are appointed by the ICC, go and have sort of a chat with them independently to see if they agree to what has been stated. Last but not the least is probably in case of individuals in which it's a recurrent pattern, we will also carry out a review and a check into their past background. That is not to say that whatever they did there will influence this current matter, but it just helps build up a trend saying if a person X who's under a cloud has been a complaint has been made against him, if there were similar in other instances that happened in his employment in the last 3 years, that's a reasonably useful piece of information for the ICC to ponder on. So whatever data, information, whatever leads available, an agency like ours will sort of carry out all that investigation and bring it to the ICC for their consideration.
We also have a question whether ICC needs to meet even if there are no cases that are reported. I think the answer to that is yes. Irrespective of whether cases are reported or not, the ICC does need to meet on a regular basis. How does the law deal with false cases of sexual harassment brought to the ICC?
So I think in the grievance redressal mechanism, I had said that in case the allegations are not proved, the ICC also has the responsibility to check whether these the allegation was completely false and made with a malicious intent. So typically, again, and sort of delving into my past, where we sort of helped ICCs conduct such investigations to try and figure out what was the malicious angle resulting in the complainant making a false complaint against the accused. And in that case, again, there are penal measures that need to be sort of taken against the person making the false complaint.
Right. Gunjan Saxena asks, what if the respondent resigns during the investigation? This is very interesting, and it has happened also in many cases. So, of course, the employer is not supposed to accept the resignation until the inquiry process is completed. And the person who has resigned, the respondent, needs to be informed via an email from the ICC that he is under a particular inquiry and there's a complaint that has been made against him. Until the inquiry is complete, the respondent should not be relieved from the organization. Sethuram asks, can the ICC take a suo motu action based on the complaint from complainant without any information to the accused, based on evidence from the complainant?
Muting.
Yeah. So the ICC cannot take action without informing the accused. The premise is principles of natural justice, which means that both the complainant and the respondent need to be aware. So the respondent needs to be aware of what is the complaint that has been made against him, and he needs to be given an opportunity to also clarify or provide any evidence from his side. While there may be evidence that can be used by the ICC definitely to take action, but it cannot be without any information to the accused. How can an organization protect the complainant from any future retaliation by the accused, such as where it is between a reportee and a supervisor? By Shonali.
Okay, that's an excellent question. So I think two things that need to be done, right? Once the complaint has been made, the inquiry is set up, and let's assume the simple part is the allegation gets proved, the person is penalized, end of story. Hopefully the person will be not a part of the company. In the case where the inquiry is inconclusive, right, which is the tricky part, where you clearly, the allegations have not been established, but clearly it has not been established that they were done with a malicious intent. In that part, the best way is to sort of ensure that the complainant ceases to be part of the reporting line of the individual against whom the complaint was made. Obviously, in technical roles, whereby let's say both of them are playing a very technical role, it becomes very difficult to identify an alternate division practice where that can be done. But I think the company should make every effort to ensure that the complainant and the person and the accused do not function in the same function and do not have share the same professional relationship whereby the complainant either reports the accused or the accused is higher up in our hierarchy in terms of in the order of things.
We have one more question from Jyoti. In a virtual investigation, if the complainant or the respondent are not comfortable joining via video call, can ICC force to join on a video?
No, I think I covered that in the force majeure part. I don't think ICC can force anybody. And as I said, there are genuine issues whereby the complainant may not be able to come on a video call. So probably I don't think the way it is done is this process is done to provide a safe into courts for safe process for the complainant to make a complaint. So obviously I don't think the ICC can force. As I had said in my in the force majeure slide, that in case for whatever reason virtual hearing cannot happen, then the ICC has to wait for more favorable conditions to resume, normal conditions to resume. For example, end of lockdown, and then perhaps take it forward.
I think last two questions we'll take. I think one of these questions has been repeated by several people. If a branch office has 20 employees but no female employees, does the ICC still need to be constituted? How should these be constituted within the organization, considering that there are no women employees?
I want to take that.
Yeah. So although there may not be any female employees, but the law still states that you need to have an ICC, because you could still have contract staff, you could have visitors, you could have people, coming in for interviews who would be coming to visit your work premises. And given that situation, it is always advisable to have an ICC constituted. Of course, you will have the issue of having a woman member on the ICC board. But that will have to be looked in by the organization. But it is advised, whether in the organized or unorganized sector, to have an ICC constituted. And I think the last question: how do you handle complaints of a heinous nature, such as allegations of rape? Is it under jurisdiction of ICC, and should the ICC continue with the investigation or help the complainant to file a police complaint?
My sense is, and Kashmir, you can back me up. If it is a complaint of a heinous nature like rape, then ICC will take over, because ICC specifically is formed under the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act. A rape would clearly be under ICC, and potentially the regulatory authorities have to take that forward. Kashmira?
Absolutely. And in such instances, ICC does extend support to the complainant to reach out to the relevant authorities, whether it's police or anybody else. So that support is always extended by the ICC of the organization to help the complainant to take it up with relevant regulatory authorities.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for taking out time to have a chat with us and sort of share these wonderful questions. As Kashmira said, we have tried to answer as much as possible, but given the paucity of time, I had put my and Kashmira's email ID on the slide. So please feel free to reach out to us, and please let us know in case if you need any support in terms of fixing your policies, helping with your policies, or with the ICC or any investigation of any nature, and we'll love to help. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.